welcome back to another Timeout Tuesday podcast. My name is Josh Pardee, senior pastor here at Hopevale, and I am joined along again with Nate Murray, our executive pastor. How are you today, Nate?
I'm doing great.
And Sam Burke, our
Hi.
campus pastor at Saginaw. How are you, Sam?
I'm doing great. Not as good as Nate.
Not as good as Nate. That's where we need to start today's conversation because today is Tuesday. We are filming. Sometimes we film on Mondays, but today's Tuesday. And last night, your Celtics won the Eastern Conference Finals.
Sweep.
The sweep wasn't even a gentleman's sweep, just a straight up sweep.
It was, yeah.
Well, I'm done talking about the Celtics.
I'll take it, even that amount.
But
Right.
congrats. I feel I'm glad to know someone that I love and care about likes the Celtics.
Okay.
So, and that I respect you, so,
Right.
because I can't say that for every team. So,
Yeah.
you are doing good redeeming work for me. I'm on a long journey. So please be praying for me.
All right, who do you like the Pistons?
Yeah, I like the Pistons. So lots of hard feelings there with the,
Yeah.
the
It's been a hard
Celtics.
road the last 20 years?
Yeah, it's been tough. But if
gotta be more
anything,
than
it's been
They won in what, 20?
04.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But the good news is Pistons fans is we are also usually Lions fans. So we are used to just being down in the dumps of society for a long time. So, yeah.
Well, the good news is you got the number 5 pick again.
All right, we got to talk about something more important, which brings us to your sermon, which was really great. So you were talking about how Jesus says, "I am the vine," and I wanted to start off by talking about just this topic in general, because I know that you love this topic and talking about our identity in Christ. And so would love for you to give maybe just a little bit of a backstory here of why that's so important to you and kind of what impact that's made on you throughout your life, all that good stuff, all the things that maybe people don't hear in the sermon time of why you're so passionate about this topic.
For sure. So my dad was a pastor. His dad was a pastor. So I grew up in the church. They did a great job teaching, and so I always had an understanding of God's love and grace. But as a 20-something-year-old pastor, I was burning out, and I got to a church in East Texas, and there was a man named Robert Carter, who was my senior pastor there. And I had developed over the years what I would label as achievement flesh, which is in the flesh. The way I talk about the flesh, I think we talk about it this way too, is just us operating independent from God. So when we try to do things in our own strength, out of our own resources, on our own timelines, that's the flesh, where we're trying to, in a lot of ways, to get back to what we had in the Garden of Eden, but we're trying to do it ourselves apart from God. So I had developed this habit of turning to achievement to try to feel good about myself and to find a place in the world. And I drew my identity from that, and it wasn't working. And that senior pastor, Robert, recognized that, and he began to teach me about my identity in Christ. And so one of the kind of visuals that I used for it is I always understood where the basement of God's love was. It was like, I'll never lose his love past this point. But I firmly believed I could increase God's love for me, and that if I performed enough and if I did enough, that God would love me more and more and more. And I began to realize there at that time that because my identity is not based on what I do, but on what Jesus has done, that there's no way for me to achieve and grow God's love for me. He fully loves me now. And that's rooted in an understanding that it doesn't matter how much I achieve. My identity is not based on my accomplishments. My identity is based on what Jesus has accomplished for me. And then along with that I cannot accomplish what I'm aiming to. And so that's part of the reason I love John 15. It's my favorite chapter in my favorite book in the Bible, because it unpacks that very idea that apart from Jesus, we can't do anything. And the sooner we realize that, the sooner we can stop trying to do things in our own strength and depend on him instead. So that's why it's meaningful. And it transformed my life. As a pastor, at the time we didn't have kids yet, but it transformed our marriage, Amanda and I. And then it definitely shaped my approach as a parent too. So,
Yeah, so you had, because that's actually what I was going to ask next. So you had that kind of experience conversion almost pre-kids, right? So that would shape that at all, shape that a lot. I was just wondering, thinking about our kids, right, and how I think that's probably true of what you said of we have like that baseline, but it's not like we also are going to love our kids more. Like,
Right.
oh, our kid got an A instead of a B. Now you receive more of my love, right? We would actually identify that, and we do, I think, a lot of times through movies and books of like how unhealthy that is, right? And how that deforms people and it doesn't help them flourish into all that they're called to be.
Well, we definitely live in an achievement culture,
Right.
where achievement is rewarded,
Right.
and you do want to do well, you
Right.
do want to work hard, and there are benefits to working hard and achieving. But when it comes to identity, it's one thing to get a raise because you've worked really hard at work for a few years and it's recognized. It's another thing to find your identity and whether or not you get that raise.
Totally.
And that's what happens with our culture and our society, is that we do draw identity from those achievements. So yeah, for sure. I know it's impacted the way we talk to our kids, and there's things like grades where we're like, we don't care if you get an A, a B, or a C. We just want you to use your gifts and use them well. So if you work really hard and you do your best and you get a C, that's great. We'll celebrate it. And really the flip side, if you got an A and you breezed through and that wasn't the best that you could do, like you could have, done more with the gifts you've been given than what you did. That's, we're going to talk about that. We're not going to celebrate that.
Right.
But then the other phrase that we use a lot is, there's nothing you can do to make me stop loving you.
Yeah.
There's nothing you can do to lose my love. And when, I heard those types of things growing up, my parents were amazing, but I do think that's liberating to hear that from the people that are raising you and love you, and to know that that's God's approach to you.
Well, so the basement thing you kind of said, and you can't lose that.
Right.
But how as a parent, I'm trying to think of this with my own kids, how do you also not say, hey, well, there's also levels to this?
Yeah.
Like, it's just, this is what it is. Like,
Yeah, I think the proof is when they mess up.
right.
And I know I struggle with anger. It's one of the things I struggle with. So in the moment when they've done something that you've begged them not to do,
Right,
and you've explained this is going to be hurtful, here are the consequences that are going to happen, and then they do it anyway, and that exact consequence happens, it's really easy to flip your lid and get angry, and they feel the anger as much as they hear anything that you say. So I think in those moments when you can breathe, and you can give them grace and mercy in those moments, that for sure helps.
Right.
And I think the other trick is to admit when you're wrong. And when you have messed up, you're like, you didn't deserve that. I'm sorry. I lost my cool.
Sure.
That's not who I am. And I think that's another phrase we use in our house. And not that we're like perfect parents at all, but another phrase we use is, that's not who you really are. And we try to take them back to who they are in Jesus. So if it's like they've lied or they've done something that's just out of character, we're very careful to never say you're a liar. Instead, it's, that's not who you are.
Sure.
Like, remind them of identity in some of those statements. What do you think,
really
though?
good.
That's a good question.
What was the question I asked?
But so there's the
You're just transfixed on my beautiful Celtics hoodie.
Yeah, I was thinking about that in relation to identity.
so the whole idea of like, okay, so you're not going to take away your love from your kids.
Yeah.
But how do you avoid the trap of like, well, you can earn more of it, and kids kind of going, well, I know that my mom and dad aren't going to not love me because of this, but I can always earn more favor. Like that's his whole thing with like God was like, I'm not going to lose the basement, but I feel like there's levels to this. And how do we, as parents, help our kids avoid that trap of achieving more and more of our favor?
Yeah, I would want to change it a little bit and agreeing with Nate and saying, yeah, I want to keep speaking those words of identity, right? Of reminding them of who they are. And in our house, kind of the same thing. We're constantly trying to speak words of you belong.
Yeah.
We are for you. We will always love you no matter what. And we're at like formational age where we're trying to even plant seeds of like, hey, if something bad is going to happen down the road, or
Right.
something you don't want us to find out about, or someone's talking about something, like, you can trust us, right? Like, we'll be your allies in this. And so I think doing that, like starting the conversation just with identity, then we're giving them freedom to be all of who they're called to be. So
Right.
it really isn't going to impact whether my son gets the best score on the test or scores a touchdown or
Right.
whatever, is first chair in the choir or whatever orchestra. I don't know. I'm trying to use musical terms that are way out of my lane here. But there is this sense of like, then we can talk about that, because we've talked about it on the front end too, of then we get to process with them. So if they're disappointed that they didn't get to be the starting quarterback or they didn't get the grade,
Right.
oh, okay. But let's remember, like, that's not who you are, and you still belong, and you're still here. And so what we're doing then, I think, is trying to create a place of where they can be all that they are called to be, all that God has made them to be. And that isn't unlocking more of me in the sense of like they're getting access to me. I'm giving them all of who I am. I'm just trying to help them unlock themselves a little bit and their own formation, right? Of taking those steps. And as they do, I think they're becoming more human. They're becoming more centered on who Jesus has created them to be and living that out. So I think that's how I would frame it. Of there's not more of me to unlock as far as my faith. Like, I'm pleased with you in the same way. And I have to remind myself, and that's why I think it's so powerful, of coming to Jesus being the vine and us abiding in God and all of these things, right? It's like, if this is true, then the results out there don't matter, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that there isn't effort attached to it. It doesn't mean, of course, I'm given talents and abilities and I want to use those to the fullness of who I'm created to be, but it's not at a sense of earning or achieving who I am as a person, because that's just what gets us really wonky and distorted, I think.
Yeah, and I asked that because at a core, like on the Enneagram, I'm a 3, so I'm an achiever.
Sure.
And so that's been a part of my entire life. My wife is way better at this than I am with our kids, because she even in her phrasing of how she says things like, well, I just love watching you do what you love. Like, versus, oh, I loved it when you did this and you hit a home run or whatever, because that just it enables them to go, I don't have to achieve anything for my mom and dad to love watching me do what I love to do, kind of a deal.
Yeah.
So they could be great at it or terrible at it, but if they love it, it's like, she's like, I love watching you do
We're
what
here
you
for
love.
it, yeah.
Right.
And so I watched that and I'm like, man, you're so good at that.
That's awesome. That's awesome. All right. I want to move on to, you made a point, Pastor Nate. In verse 2, Jesus is talking and he says, he cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit. Well, every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. And you were alluding to or pointing out for us that God is pruning Jesus, right? So Jesus here is not taking the role of the gardener. He's talking about how God is the gardener and he is the one who's being pruned. And, if there's something that's not bearing fruit. So one, I just would love to hear, like, what is it, do you think, or did you find even maybe in some of your studies or research that are people talking about things that they are pointing to as far as God was pruning in Jesus?
Right.
And let me just set this up. After you said that, I was like, oh, I got to go look into this because this is fascinating.
Isn't it?
So I looked at, I don't know, let's say 8 to 10 commentaries. I just real quick, I just pulled it up, just wanted to see. And I found people who were alluding to this, but no one would dare tread in that water.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that was not like a thorough search, but it was just like, oh, that's fascinating. And I couldn't find anyone. Everyone immediately turns, and rightfully so, that's where we want to get to, is immediately turns to our own pruning.
Right.
But if you were to point out in Jesus' life what he should be pruning or that God would prune, like, what would you point out?
I do think one thing the Gospels, in at least one place, it talks about how Jesus was growing.
Yeah.
And I think we take for granted his humanity.
Sure.
And that's, I mean, I don't know at what point that line stood out to me, but it was a while back that it stood out to me of like, the implication is that there were branches in Jesus's life or whatever that were not fruitful. I'm not implying that Jesus was a sinful person.
Right.
But I am implying that, and maybe that's a comfort to us too, that just because we're being pruned doesn't mean we're sinful. It just
Totally.
means that there are things that are not fruitful, that the Father's protecting us from, saving us from, redirecting us away from. So I'm not implying that Jesus was sinful, but I am implying that there were branches that were unfruitful that the Father were pruning. And if he was growing, which the Gospels do refer to, that meant that it wasn't just in physical stature. There was a spiritual development going on in him as he grew in age. And there was definitely a preparation, you know, and I think we see that all the way through his baptism and into the desert, you know. Right. So yeah, you're not going to find a lot of commentaries that they'll mention it.
Right,
like it's acknowledged. There's like a head nod to it, but nobody's going deep into it. But it's the part that I'm fascinated by is what were those moments of pruning in his life, and what were the unfruitful branches that he's referring to. There's something there. But again, it doesn't necessarily point to sin. It just means that God is constantly working to remove the things in our life that might draw us away versus draw us toward him. So anyway.
Yeah, I think of his prayer in the garden when he's like, you know, this is what I would want, but not my will, but yours. Like he's wrestling with a little bit of that.
He learned that lesson at some point, right? And some point in his life and ministry. Yeah.
And so you just wonder if God's like, hey, this still part needs to be like, it's not sinful. It just needs to be, smoothed out a little bit.
Right.
And he's like wrestling with that. Like, I know what I have to face here. I know this is what's going to happen. But my desire is not that, because his humanity is like, this is tough. You know, this is a rough way to go. So,
yeah, I think that is really powerful too, right? The idea that there are parts of us, as you said, that need pruning, and that doesn't indicate sinful or even wrong. It may just be not even fruitful, most fruitful, right? And so like there's choices that you have to start making in your life of what is going to be the most fruitful, right? And so I think even when like this happens as you get older, right? Like when you're younger, you have the whole world in front of you and you're just trying to try out different things and get different experiences. This is all part of just natural development. But then you get into these seasons where it's like, all right, for me to be most effective here, like what does that look like? And these are questions I'm asking in my own life, right? Like, what does that look like as a family right now? What does that look like in our neighborhood? What does this look like in church? What does this look like in the community? What is this, like there is a reality that there is only so much time in my life, and there's only so much energy that I have and ability that I have. So what is the most productive thing? And I don't mean productive again by like business consumeristic metrics that we use. That could be part of it. I just want to give us imagination for something beyond that. But what is the thing that God is most wanting to mature and grow and develop, and what fruit is he wanting to produce right now? Fully realizing that fruit, life on the vine means that like there's a season where you are producing fruit, but there's also the dormant seasons. There's winter. There's a time for replenishment and just being, right? So yeah, I think that's really powerful, and one that like we in our society, it would do us well to spend some more time ruminating on and kind of lingering with and spending some time on. So all right, moving on just kind of through your sermon. You also said, we are designed to depend on Jesus as he depends on God the Father. So just kind of setting that whole scene of God is pruning Jesus. Jesus is alluding to that. But then that relationship between him and the Father is the same that us and Jesus are supposed to have. So tease that out for us. What does that look like?
Yeah, well, the whole Gospel of John is just incredible, and the way it's simple and yet profound, and the way the writer really builds arguments all the way through, right? And one of the things that you see, this is the culmination, I think, a lot of what Jesus has been teaching the disciples. It's the final discourse. We talked about that. But the idea here, this is really the first time he begins to flip this narrative for the disciples, where throughout the Gospel of John, he had been talking about how he only did what he saw the Father doing, that very explicitly he couldn't do anything apart from the Father. And he also made statements like, I only say what the Father tells me to say. So he describes in a variety of ways, John 4, John 5, John 8, all these different moments where he's describing a relationship that he has to the Father. And it's a relationship of dependence where his power, his authority, all of that comes from the Father. And if he was isolated away from the Father, he wouldn't have that power and that authority. So there, for him, just like there's power for us to be in the vine that is Jesus, that same type of relationship Jesus had with the Father. And then it's really in this passage that he flips that narrative for them and then points toward them to prepare them for what's about to happen, to say, I've been teaching you and telling you, I draw my power from the Father. I depend upon the Father for life. Now you are going to depend on me the way I've been depending on the Father. So he described and showed this beautiful relationship of dependence. It's really a picture that points back to Eden and the type of relationship that man and woman had with the Father in Eden. So he's living that kind of relationship out through the Gospel of John. And then in John 15 says, there's a lot that's about to happen. And when all of that happens, you are going to have to depend on me the way I depended on the Father. So I don't know. Yeah.
Yep, that's good. It's beautiful. I don't have anything to add to that.
Okay.
That was fantastic. I love the little history lesson there and walking us through.
Yep.
Okay, so last thing that you said, kind of one of your last points was Jesus gave his life for us to give his life to us in order to share his life through us. So talk to me a little bit more about that. And I mean, it's obviously we're pulling the same thread of what you just said, right? But pulling that a little bit further, the 10% more, as you like to say.
Yeah. So when I was a 20-something pastor, I firmly understood that Jesus gave his life for me on the cross. But I don't think I had ever progressed beyond that. And so I was saved. And if I had died at that moment in my life, I believe I would have gone to heaven. My eternal security was established in Jesus because I had accepted his death for me on the cross. But I think what God was aiming at in all of that was not just that there would be a penalty paid for sin. I think his aim in all of that was for us to receive the life of Jesus, the way Jesus received the life of the Father. And so when I began to understand what it meant that Jesus gave his life to me, not just for me, but to me, that's what began to change things for me. And that it really is like patience is one of the things I struggle with. So that's why I talked about it. Anger is one of the things I struggle with. So there's a variety of times where I walk into a situation, I'm like, I do not have what this person needs. I do not have what this situation needs, but Jesus does. And as a 20-something pastor, I didn't operate that way. I was just like, oh man, I got to muster up some wisdom for this conversation. Or I got to muster up, like I got to try harder, or I would fail and be like, man, I'm so stupid. Why can't I get this? And then, all right, I'm going to try harder next time. But instead I began to change my approach when I was discipled that way of it's not about trying harder. It's not about working more and more to achieve some standard that you're in reality never going to be able to get to. Instead, it's believing that all that Jesus was and is, he is in me now through the Holy Spirit, that he indwells me. And that if that is true, then I have all of his patience, all of his mercy, all of his love, all that he is in me now. And if that's true, then in the moment, I ask him to be in and through me what I can't be apart from him. And so, he gave his life for us, which is beautiful. But we also have to understand he gave his life to us and depend on that life the way he taught us to depend on him as the life-giving vine, to us as the branch. But then ultimately the purpose behind all of that is that he would share his life through us. So even at that point, even if you've understood that Jesus gave his life for you to give his life to you, there's an outflow of that he has given his life to you so that he can share his life through you. He doesn't want the life of Nate to be shared with people. God's aim is to get the life of Jesus shared with people, but he chooses to use me as a vessel to do that, all of us as believers to do that.
Yeah, I was reminded of a book I read years ago, and I would recommend everybody reading it. It's by Warren Wiersbe. It's called On Being a Servant of God. And he talks about, right in the opening, he says that we are conduits of God's love and his grace towards others. And when we view it that way, it's like it's this vine and branches thing where the vine gives its life to the branch so that the fruit can be produced, for others. And so it's not that the branch itself, it's producing its own life and its own fruit. It's that the vine is producing the life that gives to the branches. And so we're the conduit.
Yeah.
And so I was like, oh, that's such, I remember that book. So,
Yeah. And how many people struggle, especially like think back through your life as a believer. It's so easy to struggle and feel pressure and stress over producing life when all we're called to do is distribute the life that we've been given, that's been produced by Jesus in us. When we're worried about producing life, we're constantly going to be frustrated and failing and stressed about it because we can't produce life. But instead, we've been called to distribute that life, So, yeah, it's a great book, by the way.
Yeah, and it's the difference between the fruit of the Spirit versus the fruit of the Christian life, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm on, in charge of producing the fruit of the Christian life, I'm going to strive really hard. But it's the Spirit living in and through me that produces that. And
So let's tease that out a little bit, because that's kind of what I want to double click on a little bit, is that second part where you say to give his life to us. What does that mean as far as effort? And right, so like totally get it. God wants to do his work through me. I get into these situations as a pastor or just a mom or businessman or woman, right? Like all of these different positions where it's like, I don't have the training for this, there is no training for this, right? So there is this reality of supernatural, we can depend on Jesus. But let's tease out here for a minute. What does that mean, though? Does that mean there's no effort involved or like development? And how do I continue to cultivate that?
Right.
So an example would be, I'll tease this up a little bit. I did a class this past year called Apprenticing Jesus, where we invited in some people to a discipleship group, and we were kind of talking about this idea. And so one of the ways I set it up is, okay, there is this sense in which you do have to train and you have to live into things, right? Like, I can say, like, or let's start this way, in theme of Boston Celtics, right? Like, I can work at being a basketball player, but like the question is, at what point did I become an athlete, or at what point did I become a basketball player? Did I ever become a basketball player? Right. So I played high school basketball, college basketball. Sam, you did too. Did you play basketball? How long did you play for?
I played baseball and football.
Oh, you were baseball, football.
Yeah, I played basketball, but not on a team.
Okay. So you're going to have to imagine with us. Okay. You're not in this scenario like Sam and I are.
Right.
Okay. But like, at what point do I become an athlete, right? Or a basketball player or whatever it is. And how does that differ between me just saying like, well, I believe I can do these things, right? Like there has to be a level of training. And the opposite of that would be if I go around and say, well, I'm an astronaut, right? Like if you hang around with me for like 5 minutes, you're going to find out pretty quickly I know very little about science or any of these things, right? Like the idea that I could be an astronaut.
Right.
So let's take this idea of, but what if I'm an astronaut and I'm looking for Jesus? Like, can I just say I'm an astronaut, but I just need Jesus to fill all of this vacuum of knowledge that I don't have? Does that make sense? Right? Like, how do we tease this out of, how do we participate in this with the Spirit? So we are flowing in the same direction and not just get to a place where it's like, well, I don't really also have to try.
Right.
What does that look like?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple steps there. So if I'm teaching another man how to do this, if I'm discipling someone, so let's use the anger situation first, and then we can dive into bigger things. But in the moment that I feel angry, I have to remember that my identity is not in my anger, right? My identity is in who Jesus is. And Jesus is not flippantly angry, selfishly angry. That's not who he is. But to know that, the first step is I have to know who Jesus is, to know how he functions in me, and to live in the reality of all that he was and all that he is in me now. I have to know who he was. I have to read the Gospels. I have to understand what his life looked like. And I have to understand the characteristics and qualities that he had. To believe that he's patient, I have to have learned the moments where he showed patience in the Gospels. And it's in those moments I'm like, well, he dealt with the idiot disciples all the time. And they were constantly failing and constantly not understanding, and yet he continually operated with patience with them. And if he can deal with those 12 to 100 morons for 3 years and still love them and patiently lead them, then I can patiently lead my child in this situation, or I can patiently deal with this person who's trying my patience, right? So step one is I have to know who Jesus is if I'm going to live as though he indwells me. And then as I know him and as I grow in my knowledge of who he was, then I call on that knowledge to, in the moment, realize this is who he is. So if I need his wisdom, here are moments he was wise. I'm going to remember those moments. And then I think what you're getting at is the moment where we live as though all that Jesus was, he is in us now. And so the rubber hits the road in the moment where, like, if I'm feeling angry, I'm like, that is not who I am. That doesn't define me. Jesus is the one who defines me, and he is full of patience. And if he's full of patience, then I am full of patience. So now I live as though I am full of patience. So in this moment, I'm not drawing on my patience. I'm living as though I have all of Jesus's patience. So if I had all of Jesus's patience, what would I then do? And it's, I would listen before I speak, right? It's, I would not jump to the worst possible conclusion. I wouldn't write false narratives in my brain. I would instead really try to practice compassion, the kind of compassion Jesus had, where he looked at the masses who were following him when he just wanted to get away for a moment and got on a boat to go to a distant place, and then they ran on foot and were waiting for him on the other shore. And in that moment, what scripture says is that he had compassion on them because they were, you know, sheep without a shepherd. And so it's that kind of, if Jesus was in this moment, he would put himself in the shoes of this person, and I would try to see the world from their point of view. And if I do all those things, then all of a sudden I do have more patience. I'm not as angry. But where the rubber hits the road is living as though all that Jesus was, he is in us now. It's not, I know Jesus was patient, so I'm going to walk away now. It's having eyes to see, what does Jesus want for this person that's trying my patience? And what does he have for them in this conversation? And how is he going to share his life through me right now? And then praying and asking him, I don't have the patience this person needs. In fact, they've exhausted my patience, but I know they haven't exhausted yours. And I know in this conversation, in this interaction, you want to draw them near to the Father. So how are you going to do that? And then as he reveals that to you, you do it. You know, it's, sure. They need someone to listen to them. They need someone to not judge them for the first time ever. They're expecting you to reject and condemn them. They need acceptance and love right now. And as he shows you who he is in you, based on what you've known him to be, then you live as though that's really true. So another example, like if you want a really practical one, when Amanda and I were first learning all this, all she ever really wanted was long walks and talks. As a young married couple, she's like, I just want to go for a long walk and talk. And as a young, newly married guy, one of the least interesting things in the world to me was a long walk and talk. But I began to realize that Jesus had something to share in and through me for my wife. Mm-hmm. And there came a moment as I began to understand my identity more and more where I found myself walking and talking and not doing it out of obligation, but genuinely enjoying the process of Jesus in me giving my wife what she needed, which was a long walk and talk. And I genuinely enjoyed it. And in those moments, instead of like, when are we going to get home so I can play video games or I can do whatever else? Instead, it's like really listening and asking Jesus what he had for her in those moments and what he wanted to give her. Right. I don't know if that makes sense, but
yeah, yep. No, that's good.
Yeah, I just think of 3 words that pop in my head with this. It's knowledge, obedience, and experience. So there's part of discipleship is a knowledge, right? So Jesus tells his disciples, go and make disciples, baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and teach them to obey all that I've commanded you. So there's a knowledge aspect of growing and what it means to follow Christ. There's the obedience aspect of doing what you know to be true. And then there's the experiential part where the Spirit comes in and infuses and going, okay, am I in step with the Spirit or am I out of step with the Spirit? And I think sometimes one or the other outpaces, but I think the goal is to go, okay, how are all 3 of these things informing my walk with Christ? And so as I disciple people, I'm saying, okay, there may be a season where knowledge is the most important thing right now. And then obedience as a second, like right close to that. What are you doing with what you know to be true? And then, maybe the experience of being sensitive to the Holy Spirit and where he's leading will eventually start working its way in. And you go, wow, that was, anger. That was not, how I should have responded there. That's not according to the Spirit. But sometimes to go that route first without knowledge and obedience can be kind of a dangerous thing. It's like, how do I know if I'm being led by the Spirit or not in those moments? So I kind of play with those concepts when I'm trying to disciple people.
Yeah. I was thinking about in all of it, a quote by Dallas Willard. I went and pulled it. It says, there's no problem in human life that apprenticeship to Jesus cannot solve. And so I was just thinking about that in context of what you were talking about with life on the vine and Jesus being the vine. And I think that that's right. That doesn't mean that you're going to have all the answers necessarily every time right then and there. And it leaves room for where you started with this reality of we're going to need pruning at times, right? There's going to need to be some things that need to be removed. But the reality is that Jesus could solve all of those problems. So we have access to all of that if we're willing to live into that, right? And then that leads me to like one of my all-time Willard quotes where he's talking about grace, and he says, grace is not opposed to earning it, or grace is opposed to earning, not to effort, right? And so there's a sense of which walking with Jesus, life on the vine, all this stuff, like it doesn't mean that we're abdicated of responsibility. Like you're proposing the exact opposite, right? It's this abiding presence dwelling in us, this life of Jesus that's given for us, that is given so that we can live his life. Let me get your words right here. Jesus gave his life for us to give his life to us in order to share his life through us, right? And that's what I see you doing with that, right? Is like this idea of it's this holistic thing of we're living into this life because it gives us access to life and life to the full. There's still effort involved, but it's not earning identity or achieving or any of those things. It's just living into our vocation of who we're called to be. And when we do, humans flourish. We flourish. Our families flourish. Our communities flourish. Our church flourishes. So it's a high challenge for us all. So, well, thanks so much for sharing. Any last 10% thing that you want to throw out outside of go Celtics in the NBA Finals?
No, that's pretty much go Celtics.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll leave on that note. And thank you so much for teaching us. And it's great. And excited to see how God continues to use it in our lives. Thanks for joining us for another week here on the Timeout Tuesday podcast. Have a great week, and we will see you on Sunday.